Assalamu alaikum, and welcome to Middle Way Mom Reads, where we dig into books that enhance and inform our homeschooling journey. I'm Shannon, a homeschooling mom since 2009 and a student of the Islamic Sciences, working toward my bachelor's degree in Islamic Sciences from Mishka University. I've been using the Charlotte Mason method since 2016, and I'm hoping that this series helps more parents realize the value of the Charlotte Mason method in their homes. We're starting with the most classic book in the Charlotte Mason method, the first book in her 6-volume series titled Home Education. We'll work through the book together, inshallah. I'll discuss highlights of the book without the assumption that you have read it yourself, but of course, you'll gain a much greater understanding if you read the book as well. So today we're picking back up with a section about fresh air, both indoors and out. And while this does not sound like the most riveting conversation, I think that it's really, really important, and I can see why she spent some time in her book talking about this. The first section that we're coming across is called Air as Important as Food. So she reminds us of what we already know, but there's always things that we know, but the reminders are valuable for us. So she talks about this constant exchange of air and its absolute necessity that we have to give the body fresh air for full function. Um, and she goes on at one point to kind of talk about, the invalid who doesn't leave the house and, the saying, you can't just live on air. But she says, out of the three things that we need, food, water, and air is the thing that we can't live without for the shortest amount of time. So I think we take it for granted. And so she has a couple sections where she's really just spelling it out. We have this exchange that happens every single minute, multiple times a minute, and we take that for granted. So that she says the children should walk every day. And quoting her, she says, they're never out less than an hour when the weather is suitable. That is better than nothing. And she goes on to have this whole conversation about this being the least of what's suitable. And she gives an example of I didn't look this up. It was a teacher asking a student about what they ate for lunch, and they said, well, my mom just gave me like a half penny or something, and so I bought the cheapest thing because I could get the most with this half penny. And it's like, well, yeah, you got more, but you didn't get something that was very good for lunch. Kind of like you can have Lucky Charms for breakfast, but is that going to suit you as a student 2 hours later when you're trying to study versus like an egg sandwich or something like that? Um, and I do want to say too, she gives these really lofty goals throughout this book and other books as well. And it's really easy to say, but I can't do that. And that we dismiss it. I think it's really important to focus on what we can do instead of focusing on what we can't do. Okay, so let's say that we can't do an hour a day. Could we do 20 minutes a day? Could we walk around the block or go to the park or whatever? She'll later on in this book, we'll actually talk about some of the things that you do when you're outdoors. Because I think for people who don't spend a lot of time outdoors, it's like, okay, well, I'm here. What do we do now? So she has some suggestions that we'll come to probably about 2 episodes after this. But if we can do an hour a day, especially this is written for children 9 and under, particularly if you have children who are toddlers and preschoolers, like get them out. Start this habit now where they know how to play outside. Um, yeah, that's a whole nother conversation. So she goes on to say, possibly science will bring home to us more and more the fact that animal life, pent under cover, is supported under artificial conditions, just as is plant life in a glass house. So this made me think about how animals in the zoo generally do not live as long, or animals in captivity generally do not live as long. There are exceptions to this because once they're like, let's take deer or elk or these type of things, like once they get old, they're not being hunted by anything, so that can artificially extend their life. But there's a lot of animals that, if they're more of like a hunter, they're not going to live as long in captivity versus being the prey. So if we are kept in quote captivity throughout our lives, kind of kept boxed up, we move from here to the kitchen, from to here to the bathroom, to here to the living room, and we spend days and days like this, then what happens to our vitality and how does that affect our longevity? While I was reading this, it made me think like we have, like people are just kind of naturally more slender, naturally more heavy set. My husband, for instance, is just like a naturally slender guy. For myself, I'm kind of, what do they call it? Like mid-size. I'm not plus size and I'm not slender, like in this mid-size. And no matter what I do, I tend to just stay here. And it made me wonder, like, I, is there a study or could we do a study? Is there any kind of correlation between how much time we spend outdoors? Not necessarily just like running around and stuff, but like just being out of captivity essentially is kind of where my brain was going with this. Um, is there any correlation? Now, I'm not saying that there is, but that question came up in my mind. I wonder if we could study this. I wonder if there is a correlation of the less that you're outside as a kid, the heavier set you tend to be as an adult. I mean, there's genes and everything too, but I don't know. I can't answer that question, but just sharing where my brain went with that. Um, and then she goes on again to just detail how oxygen quickly spreads throughout our body and supports us in numerous ways, and that this is a marvel that we overlook every day, every single day. We have I believe it's a hadith of the man who is, he, so it's more of a fable, it's a fable, right? The man who spent his entire life in worship, right? Like think of, like a Buddhist monk or something, like entire life in worship. And then when he met Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah asks him, do you want me to enter you into Jannah based on your deeds or based on my mercy? And the man said, I want you to enter me into Jannah based on my deeds. And Allah said, for the not recompense, the work, I guess, the work for the blessing of being able to see with one eye is a lifetime of worship. And you have two eyes. So you're deficient. You don't have enough. So even this, like just the breaths that we take day in and day out, not that like with every single breath we're like, oh my gosh, it's amazing, but like how often do we think about it? Once in a lifetime? Once every 25 years? Once every, like, I don't know if I've thought about it in the last 10 years until now. So it's just one thing to maybe, if you keep like a dua book and we're writing elements of, being thankful, this would be something to be thankful for. She does say, this next section, if you're following along, we're on page 30, oxygen has its limitations. She says why this element is subject to an enormous drain within the four walls of a house where the air is more or less stationary. She said, think of the heavy drain upon the oxygen, which must support the multitudinous fires and many breathing beings congregated in a large town. Now, alhamdulillah, in our time, we don't have as many fires going, right? But if you're thinking like around 1900, this is your primary source of heat. This burns up oxygen in large part. And so it got me thinking through, yeah, I mean, what was the air quality like if you're in a large town or even in a home? I know we had insulation put in our previous home. And it was interesting. They had like this thing that you put over the door, and they measure the air exchange that is still available when when they're when they're like sealing things up and putting in insulation, because they said you can't insulate it to such a point that there's no air exchange. There has to be air exchange. So they had a way to to measure this. And it made me wonder how much air exchange they had at this time. I guess in my modern sensibilities, I tend to think, well, things were probably really drafty, but I mean, maybe they weren't. Maybe, maybe things were very sealed up. But even still, even knowing that this is accounted for a bit, in our own family, my husband is home, working from home. The four of us, myself and my three daughters, we're home. The five of us are home all the time. So just thinking through, if when we're all closed up in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the winter, what is the air quality throughout that time? She says, is it too much to say that vitality is reduced, other things being equal, in proportion as persons are house dwellers rather than open air dwellers? So, and she reminds us, yes, we need our house. Nobody's saying like sell your house and live outside, but we have more potential physically and mentally when we are outdoors in fresh air more often. And we see studies are coming out about this in Japan. Now it's become a thing to do forest bathing, of just being outdoors. And there's a book called Vitamin N. No. Uh so I didn't read that book. I read Last Child in the Woods. And I think it's like Robert or Richard Louv, Louv. I'll have to link that in the show notes here. He also wrote Vitamin N, but the one that I read was about Last Child in the Woods. And he was making the case for this too. So there's a lot of times, I've said this before, where you kind of read through Charlotte Mason and you're like, okay, some of this like scientific stuff that she talks about, I don't know how much it holds water 100 years later, but the end result, the conclusions that she comes to, that, crack open your window, be outside, so on and so forth, all of these still hold truth. The next section is called Unchanged Air. She says the child who spends its days in the streets is better supplied with oxygen than he who spends most of his hours in the unchanged air of a spacious apartment. So that was like such a great picture of a child who has everything, the spacious apartment, right? So we're talking about London or Britain in general. I'm going to assume London just based on a lot of the stuff she talks about being, kind of in the city. So you have like, mashallah, you have this beautiful apartment. And she said, you know what? The guy who's begging in the street, he has better quality air than the person who's cooped up in that spacious apartment. She says, but it is not the air of the streets the children want. It is the delicious, life-giving air of the country. So she goes on talking about like while they're outside, they're using their muscles, right? Like we don't just want to sit outside. Sometimes we go for a walk. I live near a busy street, and we'll walk along that street because it's just like that's how you get places, right? That's how you get to the places that you want to go. You have to be on this busy street. There's semi trucks driving, and it's not that fun to walk on. The air does feel different than when we're in the forest or in the prairie. So we can, good, better, best. It's good to be outside, best to be, out in the open air. And when they like in the country, more or less. So when they're out in the country, they have more of an ability to run and jump and play. And so they're using those muscles. So she says they need that nourishment and repair through proper nutrition and fresh air. So we talked a little bit about proper nutrition before. You know, as with all of this, it's more of a method than a system. of just kind of having these things that we're thinking through day to day. Serving fruit with breakfast was one of the things in the last one, having some variety in the meals, so on and so forth. And this one about having fresh air. So that way, when you expend yourself, that your body has what it needs to nourish itself and to repair itself. And then she goes on talking about if they are if we're meeting the needs of their physical bodies, what about their eager, active, curious, hungering mind? In this example, she says the parent responds, "Oh, she has her lessons regularly every day." Probably. But lessons which deal with words, only the signs of things, are not what the child wants. So do not just sit down and read a book about rivers and lakes and streams. Get out of the house and go to the rivers and lakes and streams so the child can see this and experience it. We just visited the ocean not long ago, and there's no way that I could have explained that experience, explained the sound of the ocean without them being there. Now, if this was unavailable to me, I would do my best. But what she's saying is that hungry mind. We've talked about the hungry body and the hungry lungs as it goes. And now we're talking about the hungry mind. And this is best satiated with real things in their original environment. So then she talks about indoor airings. If there's any husbands listening, we're going to go stereotypical here. If there's any husbands listening, you're not going to like this part, but this is important. She's talking about if the air is stuffy at home, then your outdoor activity is not going to have the same refreshing effect as it would. Like think of, if you're, this is really just a metaphor. I'm not saying that your lungs get dirty, but let's just go with this metaphor that, like, as you're kind of in this stuffy air, your lungs are getting dirty, dirty, dirty. And when you're outside, you start that cleaning process. You're not going to get to 100% in, this hour a day, if you're able to do that, if you have a really stuffy home. But if you air out your home, then you keep refreshing your home with oxygenated air. Because what she keeps saying is, like, we're using the oxygen, and we know this to be true. We know this to be true. This is how people can suffocate. And, like, in this room that I'm in, if it was filled wall to wall with people and we didn't open the window, I mean, it is possible eventually we would suffocate. So while we're not in danger of losing our lives, what is this doing to our vitality intellectually and physically? She says, therefore, regular provision must be made for the ventilation of rooms, regardless of the feelings of their inmates. At least an inch of window open at the top, day and night, renders a room tolerably safe, because it allows the escape of the ventilated air and so on and so forth. Obviously, air comes in and comes out. So, I live in Minnesota. It is cold here. Like, we're talking, I mean, it hits -10 Fahrenheit every year. It would be surprising if we had a year where we did not hit -10 Fahrenheit. On the other hand, we hit 100 degrees Fahrenheit every year also. So we have at least 100-degree swing of temperatures here. And still, at least, at night, if we can ventilate it, or, even in the winter, just keeping like a little bit of the window open just to keep that fresh air coming in. Yes, I know you're paying for heated air to get out, but well, you'll just have to think through that yourself. But this is the advice that she gives. She goes on to talk about actually being outside. And there's a whole section that we're going to like really dig into this. Right now, we're just kind of scratching the surface about being outside. She makes the case that we should allow the sunshine to be into the windows as best as possible. She even talks about cutting down some trees. I don't know about that. Like, that also kind of undoes some of the cleansing of the air on the outside. But I suppose there's some houses that I've seen that are like completely surrounded by trees. So it would be very, very dark to inside the house. But she says, even if you can choose where their room is, have the kids on the south side of the house. So that way the sun is shining directly into their rooms. And then this last section, I found really interesting. I actually did not really remember reading this the first time around. She's talking about free perspiration, and this isn't exactly what it sounds like on the cover, because we're thinking like sweating, but she is talking more about just like the um, your perspiration on a day to day. Like, I'm not sweating right now, but I am perspiring, right? Like, there is an exchange through my skin. As we know, the skin is your largest organ. Um, so we shouldn't hinder that perspiration even when we're sitting indoors. And she makes the case to look at your sheets and your blankets and your clothing to have those be natural materials. She says that wool is better than cotton and linen because you have a better exchange. In all the crunchy communities, wool is the top choice for exactly the reasons that she said. It's not like holding the heat in. It also allows for exchange. It's naturally absorbent, all of these type of things. But in our day and age, if you're looking for one thing to do and you're like, oh my gosh, like, we have no wool clothing, it's expensive, so on and so forth, look at how much polyester clothing that you have. So could there be a reduction in polyester, or at the very least, not using polyester for their sheets and blankets? I know I have this blanket, and there's like this joke I saw it, I think on Instagram or something, where they were saying like it's an ethnic blanket. And granted, very few people consider me ethnic, but we got it when we were on Hajj, alhamdulillah. I call it my Hajj blanket. We got it in Arafat. Funny story, my kids, when they were smaller, they're like, where's the blanket you got from Jannah? I'm like, I didn't get it from Jannah. I got it from Arafat. Like, cute. But it's that polyester that, like, man, that blanket will keep you warm. It's so warm. But one of the reasons why it keeps you warm is because there's no exchange of air. Like, it just holds in that body heat. So whenever you can, there's times where you need that. You need to hold in all your body heat. Again, look at where you are. Is there a next step that feels attainable to you? And if that's moving toward natural clothing materials, natural blanket materials, then alhamdulillah. And then she also says, bathe daily and scrub the skin when you're bathing. And that does not necessarily mean washing of the hair. I know with my, I have all girls, so I think like, oh, the washing of the hair is like just really adds to the chore. It doesn't have to be washing of the hair every time that they bathe, but still scrubbing the skin and allowing for that perspiration in that way, allowing those pores to not get clogged. She goes on to say, we might say much on this one question, the due nutrition of the brain, upon which the very possibility of healthy education depends. So this whole section, a lot of it I summarize, but when I'm saying she's talking about the scientific backing for this and the reasoning for that, again and again, she's talking about the nutrition of the brain. All of this flows to the nutrition of the brain. She says, but something will have been affected if the reason why of only 2 or 3 practical rules of health is made so plain that they cannot be evaded without a sense of law breaking. So again, if you're not going to do all of it, I think most of us can't. But find 2 or 3 things that you're like, I can implement this. I can be outside for an hour a day, or I can serve fruit at every breakfast, or I can make sure that my children have plain but varied foods, or I can crack the window. Have 2 or 3 things that you think to yourself, this is going to become a habit, and to the point that if you don't do it, you feel like you're breaking the law. And lastly, she talks about these are physiological matters. And, when an eager homeschooler picks up a homeschooling book and then they're talking about air and nutrition and your clothing, like all these things that you're like, this is not what I picked up this book for. I picked up this book. How am I going to teach my kid to read? How am I going to teach them multiplication tables? But she says, we think of this as the lowest rung of education. So she says round, the lowest round of the educational ladder. But the lowest round it may be, but yet it is the lowest round, the necessary step to all the rest. This is the foundation in which all your other educational decisions rests. If your child does not have proper nutrition to support their growing bodies and their growing brains, no $100, $300, $500 curriculum is going to fix that. So we really need to start at this base, at this foundation of healthy habits in order to build upon that with knowledge and, books and so on and so forth. She says, the good and clever man requires much animal substance to make up for the expenditure of tissue brought about in the exercise of his virtue and intellect. And I like that she puts this together. In our times, we talk a lot about people being essentially animals, not saying that in the negative sense of like, oh my gosh, he's such an animal, like he doesn't have control over himself or whatever. But like, there's a lot of needs that animals have that we have. This is something that's very clear. It is not contested anywhere. And so we need these animal substances for our body to function, for both our virtue and our intellect. It's not just about us staying upright, right? In the Sunnah, the best way to eat is just you eat enough to stay upright, that you're not filling to your full and you start slouching, or you're not holding back so much that you have a hard time sitting up. I feel this during Ramadan, toward the end of the month. There's a lot of people who say like the first days are really hard for them, and then they just kind of get in a groove. I am opposite. The first couple days are not hard for me, alhamdulillah. But then as the month goes on, I just kind of feel like that vitality is really starting to drain. And it's hard for me to sit up straight and be alert. So having this baseline, having this foundation allows for the clever man, the good and clever man, to use his virtue and his intellect. It's so much easier to be virtuous when your body has the things that it needs, that your nafs is not screaming out, I want something. I want something more. I want to do something, because you're not giving it the things that it needs. So this brings us to the end of this discussion about air. The next section is about, it says, the reign of law in education. So this is common sense and good intentions. Mind and matter is equally governed by law. Law-abiding lives, often more blameless than pious lives, so on and so forth. So this is a really good section that's coming up next, that's talking about like we are all law-abiding citizens in some way. There's always some kind of law that we're holding up to, whether that is Sharia for the Muslim, whether that is your reason if you're a humanist, whether that is United States law. There's different elements of law that we're all holding up to, and I really like this section because we have really downplayed the sense of duty that we should have as humans to other humans, and especially to our family, and so on and so forth. and she'll talk about this a little bit. So that'll be a little bit shorter section than today. And then after that, I'm really looking forward to getting into outdoor life for the children. This is one thing. So that won't be next time. It'll be the time after. But talking about what does that look like to be outdoors with the children on an everyday basis? What are we going to do? What value does that even have? Why should I spend my time with that? So I think that'll be a really good discussion too. So just a reminder, you will gain added benefit by reading the book yourself. You can find it at most of your favorite retailers, alhamdulillah. You can find a link to it in the description of this video or podcast. You can also find me online as Middle Way Mom on YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. On Instagram, I share our day-to-day homeschooling life as well. If you have any questions you'd like answered, you can email those to shannon@middlewaymom.com. That's SHANNEN @middlewaymom.com. Thank you so much, and assalamu alaikum.